Maybe tonight, you are carrying stones nobody else can see. Stones called fear. Stones called anxiety. Stones called, what if everything goes wrong? And maybe you have been holding them for so long. You no longer remember what peace feels like. But hear this carefully. God never asked you to carry tomorrow by yourself. He never asked you to torture your mind with futures that have not happened. He never asked you to lose today's peace trying to control things only He can control. Because fear has never healed a sick heart. Worry has never added a single peaceful day to a person's life. And anxiety has never stopped tomorrow from arriving. It only steals the strength you need for today. Maybe that is why so many people are exhausted, not because life is too heavy, but because they are carrying burdens heaven never intended for them to hold. The truth is, some of the darkest moments in your life were survived not because you were strong, but because God quietly carried you through them when you thought you would collapse. And if He carried you before, He will carry you again. So tonight, put down the stones, put down the fear, put down the endless need to control everything, and trust that the same God who has protected you this far is already waiting in your tomorrow. Because peace begins the moment you stop trying to be your own savior. And maybe worrying is an insult to God, because it forgets how many times He has already rescued you before. Grace Parker was only 16 years old, but some mornings she woke up feeling 90. Not because her body was tired, but because her mind never rested. Every morning before school, Grace quietly walked into her father's room just to make sure he was still breathing. The doctors called it a heart condition. Grace called it fear. Fear of loss. Fear of bad news. Fear of becoming completely alone in the world. While other teenagers worried about parties and relationships, Grace worried about medicine bottles, overdue bills, and whether they would still have a home by winter. Every cough from her father sounded dangerous. Every unknown phone call made her chest tighten. And every night, her imagination became a prison. What if Dad dies? What if I fail my exams? What if life never gets better? What if everything falls apart at once? The terrifying thing about worry is that it does not wait for tragedy to happen. It makes you suffer before pain even arrives. Grace's body lived in the present, but her mind lived inside disasters that did not exist yet. She could be sitting quietly in class and suddenly imagine standing at her father's funeral. She could be washing dishes and suddenly picture eviction notices hanging on their apartment door. Fear became the background music of her life. Every afternoon after school, Grace worked at a small grocery store on the edge of town. She smiled at customers, scanned groceries, told strangers to have a good evening, while secretly feeling like her own world was collapsing. Nobody noticed the panic attacks she hid inside the employee restroom. Nobody saw the tears she wiped away before returning to work. And that is the strange thing about anxiety. Some of the people carrying the heaviest burdens become experts at pretending they are okay. At night, the worrying became louder. The silence of her bedroom turned into a battlefield where fear attacked from every direction. Grace would stare at the ceiling for hours, replaying terrible possibilities over and over in her mind. She believed worrying made her responsible. She believed fear somehow prepared her for pain. But all it really did was steal the little piece she still had left. Because worry has a cruel way of convincing people that carrying tomorrow's pain today will somehow protect them later. But it never does. It only exhausts the soul. And slowly, Grace was becoming emotionally tired. She laughed less, smiled less, prayed less. Hope itself started feeling dangerous because disappointment hurt too much. Deep down, Grace felt like she was carrying invisible stones tied around her spirit. Stones named what if, failure, loss, tomorrow, control. And the heavier those stones became, the harder it was for her to hear the quiet voice of God whispering, "You were never meant to carry this alone." One cold evening after work, Grace received another hospital bill in the mail. She sat alone at the bus stop staring at the envelope while rain quietly poured onto the empty streets. And for the first time in months, she broke down completely. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears falling while the weight of life crushed her from the inside. That night, unable to breathe beneath the pressure anymore, Grace started walking without knowing where she was going. The cold wind pushed against her face as she wandered through the quiet streets of town, until eventually, she found herself standing beside a river, and sitting there near the water was an old woman with peaceful eyes, smiling as if life had never wounded her at all. Grace did not know it yet, but that conversation beside the river was about to change her entire life forever. The old woman sat quietly beside the river feeding birds pieces of bread from a small paper bag. The water moved gently beneath the moonlight while the world around her felt strangely calm. Grace could not understand it. How could someone sit so peacefully in a world filled with pain? The woman looked up slowly and smiled. Not the kind of smile people fake to hide sadness. A real smile. The kind that comes from surviving storms that should have destroyed you. "Long night?" the woman asked softly. Grace wiped her face quickly. "I'm fine." The woman smiled gently. People carrying heavy worries always say that. Something about those words made Grace sit down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of the river filled the silence. Then the woman finally said, "You're carrying things that were never meant for your shoulders." Grace frowned. "You don't know my life." The woman nodded calmly. "You're right, but I know what fear looks like." Grace looked at her carefully for the first time. The woman's face carried peace, but also pain. The kind of pain that changes a person forever. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. Then after a quiet pause, she added, 10 years ago, I lost my husband and both of my sons during a storm." Grace froze. "I lost my home too," Eleanor continued. "Everything disappeared in one night." Grace stared at her in disbelief, because the woman sitting beside the river did not look broken. She looked peaceful, and somehow, that made her story even more powerful. "There was a time," Eleanor whispered, "when I thought my life was over." Grace finally asked the question burning inside her heart. "Then how are you still smiling?" Eleanor looked toward the river and smiled softly. "Because one day, God showed me something that changed the way I carried pain forever." And under the pale moonlight, Eleanor began telling Grace about a dream she would never forget. Eleanor looked out across the river as the wind moved softly through the trees. "After my family died," she said quietly, "I became consumed by fear. Fear of the future. Fear of more pain. Fear that God had abandoned me." She paused for a moment. "Then one night, I had a dream." Grace listened carefully. "In the dream, I was climbing a mountain carrying a heavy bag on my back. At first it seemed manageable, but with every step, the bag became heavier." Eleanor's voice grew softer. "When I finally opened the bag, it was filled with stones. Each stone had words written on it." "What words?" Grace asked quietly. Eleanor looked at her. "Fear, regret, tomorrow, what if, control." Grace felt something deep inside her chest begin to tighten. "I kept climbing anyway," Eleanor continued. "I thought carrying the bag was my responsibility. But eventually, I collapsed." The river flowed quietly beside them. And then, Eleanor whispered, "I heard a voice." Grace leaned closer. The voice said, "Why are you carrying what I never asked you to hold?" Silence filled the air. Tears slowly formed in Grace's eyes, because for the first time in her life, she realized most of her suffering was coming from fears that had not even happened. Eleanor smiled gently. "That dream changed me forever. I realized worry was not protecting me. It was crushing me." She looked directly at Grace. "Fear makes people believe they are holding their lives together. But sometimes, letting go is the real act of faith." Grace lowered her eyes toward the ground, because deep down, she knew she had been carrying stones for years. Stones God never asked her to carry. Grace sat silently beside the river while Eleanor's words echoed inside her mind. For years, Grace believed worrying proved she cared. If she worried enough, maybe she could prevent pain. If she stayed afraid, Maybe she could stay prepared. But suddenly she realized something heartbreaking. Her fear had not protected her from suffering. It had only stolen her ability to enjoy the moments she still had. Eleanor gently picked up a small stone from the ground and placed it in Grace's hand. "Tell me something," she asked softly. "All those nights you stayed awake worrying, did they change anything?" Grace looked down quietly. "No." "Did fear heal your father?" "No." "Did anxiety solve tomorrow's problems?" Grace slowly shook her head again. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Worry is like rocking in a chair. It keeps your mind moving, but takes your life nowhere." The river continued flowing beside them while Grace stared at the stone in her hand. For the first time in a long time, she began seeing her thoughts clearly. Most of her pain was not coming from reality. It was coming from imagination, from living inside futures that did not exist yet. Eleanor leaned back against the bench and looked toward the sky. "Child of fear has one mission: to make you believe God will fail you." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes again, because deep inside, that was exactly how she had been living. Like everything depended on her. Like she had to carry the future alone. Like God might not come through this time. And slowly, Grace realized her worry was not strength. It was exhaustion disguised as control. Eleanor looked at her gently. "You cannot pray for peace while constantly listening to fear." Those words hit Grace deeply, because she had been feeding her anxiety every day while starving her faith. And for the first time in months, something inside her finally became still. The night air grew colder as the river moved softly through the darkness. Grace looked at Eleanor with tired eyes. "How did you finally stop worrying?" she asked quietly. Eleanor smiled gently. "I didn't stop overnight." She paused for a moment. "But eventually, I remembered something." Grace waited silently. Eleanor looked toward the flowing water and whispered 7 words that would stay with Grace forever. "God has carried me every single time." Grace felt those words sink deep into her soul. Not once did fear save Eleanor. Not once did panic rescue her. Not once did anxiety fix her pain. But somehow, God had still carried her through every storm she thought would destroy her. Eleanor looked back at Grace. "That's the lie worry tells people," she said softly. "It tells you that you are alone. But you're not." Grace lowered her head as tears rolled down her face. Because when she looked back over her own life, she realized something incredible. There were moments she thought she would never survive. Moments she thought would completely break her. And yet somehow, she was still here, still breathing, still standing. God had carried her before too. Eleanor gently pointed toward the river. "See that water?" Grace nodded. "It keeps moving because it trusts the path in front of it." Then Eleanor smiled warmly. "Faith is not believing life will become perfect. Faith is believing God will still be there even when it isn't." For the first time in months, Grace felt the weight on her chest begin to loosen. Her problems were still real. Her father was still sick. Her future was still uncertain. But suddenly, she no longer felt like she had to carry the entire world by herself. And that night beside the river, Grace finally began putting down the stones. The next morning, Grace woke up expecting the fear to return immediately. And it did. The hospital bills were still sitting on the kitchen table. Her father was still weak. Her exams were still approaching. Nothing around her had changed, but something inside her had. For the first time in a long time, Grace noticed how beautiful the morning sunlight looked coming through the apartment window. She noticed her father smiling softly while drinking coffee. She noticed little moments she had been too anxious to see before, because worry had kept her trapped in tomorrow for so long. She had stopped living today entirely. Later that afternoon, Grace walked back to the river carrying several small stones in her jacket pocket. One by one, she pulled them out. On each stone she had written a word. Fear. Control. What if? Tomorrow. Failure. She stood quietly beside the water before throwing the first stone into the river. Splash. Then another. Splash. And another. With every stone that disappeared beneath the water, Grace felt something lifting from her spirit, not because her problems were gone, but because she finally understood this truth. Peace does not come from controlling everything. Peace comes from trusting God when you cannot. Tears rolled down her face as she whispered softly, "God, I can't carry this anymore." The wind moved gently across the river while the evening sun painted the water gold. And for the first time in months, Grace felt like she could breathe again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to keep moving forward. Because faith is not pretending life is easy. Faith is believing you do not walk through it alone. And slowly, Grace began learning the difference between responsibility and worry. Responsibility says, "I will do my best today." Worry says, "I must control tomorrow." One leads to peace, the other leads to exhaustion. And Grace had been exhausted for far too long. Months passed. Grace still faced difficult days. There were nights her father's condition became worse. There were moments fear tried to return. But now, whenever anxiety began tightening around her heart, Grace remembered Eleanor's words. "God has carried me every single time." Those 7 words became an anchor for her soul. Instead of imagining the worst possible future, Grace started focusing on the present moment. She laughed more, prayed more, slept better, and little by little, peace returned to places fear once controlled. One evening, Grace sat beside the river again with Eleanor watching the sunset reflect across the water. "It's strange," Grace said quietly. "What is?" Eleanor asked. Grace smiled softly. "My life isn't perfect, but I finally feel alive again." Eleanor nodded knowingly. Because fear was stealing your life before pain ever had the chance to. Grace looked out across the river in silence. Then Eleanor spoke one final truth Grace would never forget. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for peace to arrive after their problems disappear. She smiled gently. But peace was never found in a perfect life. It's found in trusting God inside an imperfect one. Grace felt tears fill her eyes again, because she realized how many beautiful moments she almost missed while obsessing over things she could not control. The sound of rain, her father's laughter, sunsets beside the river, simple quiet moments God had still given her even in difficult seasons. Fear had blinded her to all of it. But now, for the first time in years, Grace finally understood something life-changing. The future had always been in God's hands, not hers. And maybe that was the most peaceful realization of all. Years later, Grace Parker would sit across from people carrying the same fear that once nearly destroyed her. Young mothers afraid of the future, teenagers drowning in anxiety, men silently collapsing beneath pressure nobody else could see. And every time she listened to them speak, Grace recognized the weight immediately, because she had carried those stones once too. By then, Grace had become a counselor in a small community center not far from the same river where Eleanor changed her life. On her desk sat a single smooth stone with 4 words written across it. "Not yours to carry." Many people asked about it, and every single time, Grace smiled, because that small stone carried the lesson that saved her life. One rainy afternoon, a young girl walked into Grace's office trembling with anxiety about her future. "I can't stop worrying," the girl whispered. "My mind never rests." Grace looked at her gently. Then she reached for the stone on her desk. "There was once an old woman who taught me something," Grace said softly. The girl wiped tears from her face while listening carefully. Grace leaned back in her chair and smiled. "She told me that most people spend their lives carrying fears God never asked them to hold." The room became quiet. Then Grace continued, "Worry promises control, but only gives exhaustion. It steals today's peace trying to solve tomorrow's problems. And the saddest part is, most of the terrible things we fear never even happen." The girl slowly lowered her eyes, because deep down, she understood exactly what Grace meant. Grace looked out the window as rain tapped gently against the glass. Then she whispered the 7 words that had once changed her own life forever. "God has carried me every single time." And suddenly, Grace realized Eleanor's lesson had become bigger than just her own story. It had become a light passed from one hurting soul to another. A reminder that fear may visit every human heart, but it does not deserve to live there forever. Because peace begins the moment we stop trying to carry what only God can hold. And maybe that is the lesson most people learn too late. You cannot enjoy the gift of today while living trapped inside the fear of tomorrow. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is lying awake carrying invisible stones. Stones called fear. Stones called regret. Stones called, what if everything falls apart? Maybe that person is you. Maybe you have spent months, or even years, trying to hold together a future that feels completely out of your control. But listen carefully, God never asked you to carry tomorrow alone. He never asked you to destroy your peace trying to predict every possible pain. Because worrying has never healed a broken heart. It has never stopped tragedy from arriving. And it has never added peace to a single human soul. It only steals the strength you need for today. The truth is, some of the hardest seasons of your life were survived not because you were strong enough, but because God quietly carried you when you thought you would collapse. You may not have noticed it at the time, but every breath after heartbreak, every sunrise after loss, every moment you kept going when your soul was tired, was proof that God never abandoned you. And if He carried you before, He will carry you again. So tonight, put down the stones. Put down the endless fear. Put down the exhausting need to control everything. And trust that the God who protected you yesterday is already waiting in your tomorrow. Because peace does not come from knowing the future. Peace comes from knowing who walks with you into it. And maybe worrying is an insult to God, because it forgets the thousands of times He has already made a way for you before. So sleep tonight knowing this: you are not alone. You never were, and you never will be.